Namaskar and good afternoon to one and all. All the viewers watching us from the different part of the globe. You all are aware, India is going to celebrate the 75th year of independence from 15th August 2021 onwards. And the celebration has begun. Let me mention that the world of science is something which also played a very significant role in the India's independence movement, is something that we as an organizer would like to let you know. On behalf of Vigyan Prasad, I, Arvind Ranade, would like to welcome you all. And let me tell you, today we are going to have a great online conference wherein the very great luminaries who worked in the field of science, especially the colonial science, and who has a wide experience and going to let us know the important aspect of this India's freedom struggle from the science perspective. So on behalf of organizers, Vigyan Prasad and Vigyana Bharati, we have got a panel of experts starting with Professor M.S. Sriram from Chennai. We have Professor M.D. Srinivas from Chennai. We have Professor V.V. Krishna from Sydney, Australia. And we have Professor Dinesh Kumar from Hyderabad. And as a part of the organizing team, let me also mention that this program is jointly been getting conducted by Vigyan Prasad and Vigyana Bharati. So the director of Vigyan Prasad, Dr. Nakul Parashar, and my senior colleague, Dr. Venkateshwaran, who will moderate the session. From Vigyana Bharati, we have Shri Jayanta Sahasrabuddhe, National Organizing Secretary of Vigyana Bharati, as well as the National Convener of Swathanthra Amrut Mahotsav, Dr. Ranjana Agrawal, Director, NISPER, National Institute of Science, Communication and Policy Research under the aegis of CSIR. And Dr. Ruchir Gupta, who is a National Co-Convener of Swathanthra Amrut Mahotsav. With this, I would like to invite Dr. Nakul Parashar, Director Vigyan Prasad, to welcome all the dignitaries and all the viewers across the globe. Namaskar, Dhanyavad.
Namaskar. A very warm welcome to all those who have joined this panel discussion of eminent personalities that we have from different walks of history of science. It's indeed a great pleasure on behalf of Vigyan Prasad to welcome all of you. With us today, as Dr. Arvind Ranade just said, we have Manya Jainji from Vigyana Bharati, Professor M.D. Srinivas, Professor M.S. Sriram, Professor V.V. Krishna, and Professor Deepak Kumar. All of them are subject matter experts par excellence in this domain. The reason why we requested these four learned gentlemen to come and speak with us on the topic of role of science and scientists in the Indian movement is for a plain and simple reason, that we've all known and we've all studied and we've all talked about various revolutionaries in the Indian independence. Our scientists played a great role in Indian independence, fighting all kinds of discrimination, fighting all kinds of odds, and yet they stood strong. Their indomitable spirit made them fight all the odds and steer through to get their goals. We've all known about Professor J.C. Bose, Professor P.C. Ray, S.N. Bose, and a number of unknown, unsung heroes who've actually laid their lives and forgot their own leisures and pleasures to ensure that science in India gets its firm footing, so that today, after 75 years, when we are trying to celebrate the Indian independence, we proudly say that our roots of our scientific institutions and science in the country, in the Indian independence, is as strong as any other scientific organization of a country in the world. This is all because of their hard work, perseverance, and their spirit to have fought with the colonial period, and during the colonial period, where we were just thought that we were not capable enough to do science. In such scenarios, in such ages, it's important for us to remember them, understand them, and bring out all those unknown stories that make us feel proud. I know such a topic makes you excited and you would want to go on and on, but it's important for all of us that we've joined here to hear these four eminent subject matter experts in the field of history of science. With this, I would once again welcome all of you on behalf of Vigyana Bharati and Vigyan Prasar, where we have come together for with a short and a long-term program to be organized throughout this year. It will be important for me now to invite our very senior and very accomplished Professor Ranjana Ji Agrawal, who is the director of the National Institute of Science Communication and Policy Research and has been a professor of chemistry par excellence for many, many years. On this note, I'll take your leave and would hope that we all benefit and take notes and have questions ready for our panelists today. Thank you so much. Jai Hind and Jai Bharat. Over to Ranjana ji for her welcome address. Ranjana ji.
धन्यवाद नकुल जी. Dear Dr. M.D. Srinivas, Professor M.S. Sriram, Professor Deepak Kumar, and Professor V.V.S. Krishna, we are very fortunate to have you today as our panelist on the topic role of Indian science and scientists in the Indian freedom struggle. I, on the behalf of Vigyan Bharati, welcome you all. Very briefly, I would like to share the vision of Vigyan Bharati. Vigyan Bharati is one of the largest organizations connecting Indian scientists. The motive of Vigyan Bharati is science of India, science for India. Though we say science is universal, there is no doubt about it. But also, we must understand that there is philosophical difference when we call about science of India. We have so much, rich heritage of scientific values that our science was not limited to a particular domain of scientists. Our science was for the universe. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam was the ethos of our, when we say science of India. And that, traditional heritage somehow has been lost from the main arena of the society. And today when we look at the society, we always talk about Western science. So Vigyan Bharati believes that science of India is science for India, because India is a very unique country. We need solutions through scientific interventions which are relevant in Indian scenario. We cannot borrow the solutions from West and apply it in India. So it is very important that we take the solutions and merge the traditional knowledge, the rich heritage, scientific heritage we have, and connect it with the contemporary knowledge and serve the society in the best manner. I am very pleased to inform our eminent panelists and also the audience who are joining us today that Vigyan Bharati has footprints not only in India, but across the globe. We are having a strong network of scientists and taking these ethos of Indian science to all. Various programs such as NASYA, Shakti, waste management programs, India International Science Festival you have heard of, Vidyarthi Vigyan Manthan, which is a very special program with Vigyan Prasad, where we are taking the Indian science to the masses, particularly to the school students. And when it comes to Swathanthra ka Amrut Mahotsav, this was basically a mission program which we want to run for the whole year. And we want to create a narrative in the society that science, Indian science and scientists also played as important role as the other revolutionaries, other social workers, other freedom fighters. So our scientists, Dr. Ranade took some names, they also contributed in the same way. I will not take much time because I would like to hear our panelists who have done the seminal work on the history of science. Uh, History, we generally believe, is a subject of humanities and does not have anything to do with scientists or the science. But we are very fortunate that today we have four eminent personalities with us who have done their research work on the Indian of science, particularly in the colonial period. And I think they are gone through the archives, the documents, and they will be in a much better position to share with us their experiences, that what kind of discrimination we Indians as colonized faced, how our people responded to the Western science, how Western science influenced our science, and how we have grown forward. So, with these very few words, I would like to welcome all our eminent personalities who are with us, and Dr. Nakul Parashar, Dr. Ranade, Ruchirji, Manya Jayantji Sahasrabudhe, and all the participants who are joining with us. Thank you so very much. And I would like to request Dr. Venkateshwaran to take the discussion forward. And all the participants, like आपके मन में जो भी जिज्ञासा है वो सवाल आप जरूर पूछें, क्योंकि हमारे एक्सपर्ट्स बहुत उत्साह से आपके प्रश्नों का जवाब देंगे. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. नमस्कार.
Thank you, Dr. Arvind Ranade, Dr. Nakul Prasar, and Dr. Nakul Prasar, and Dr. Rajana Agarwal, and all our four eminent speakers, and participants who are watching this program through YouTube and other various social media, and also India Science OTT channel. India is celebrating its 75th year of India's independence. On the eve of the 75 years of India's independence, it is imperative that we reflect upon our history. As part of such a reflection, it's important that we relook at the glorious role the science and technology and the Indian scientists and technologists played in the national struggle. Colonialism meant exploitation on multiple planes. Economic exploitation combined with the ruin of indigenous production and value chain addition led to mass poverty, illiteracy, and what today we usually refer as backwardness. The infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate was very high when India got its freedom. Malnutrition was rampant, and poverty was the face of earth, face of India at the time of independence. As India became free from the colonial yoke, challenges for providing nutrition, education, employment, basic medical care were key challenges that the new republic was facing. Science and technology were considered to be the harbinger of progress, and many Indian scientists and technologists not only took part in national struggle, but also attempted to harness this knowledge and their skill for national development. In this 75 years of India's independence, through these series of programs, we would like to relook at it, learn from it, and charter our future course. In today's panel discussion, we have four eminent speakers, and this panel discussion will discuss the role of Indian scientists in Indian independence movement. Like you, I am also very eager to listen to them, and therefore, without further ado, I would like to call upon our first panelist, Professor M.S. Sriram. He is currently the president of the K.V. Sharma Research Foundation, Chennai, and was formerly the faculty at the Department of Theoretical Physics, University of Madras. His research interest includes high energy physics, nonlinear dynamic systems, and Indian astronomy and mathematics. A book, 500 Years of Tantra Sangraha, which he authored with Professor K. Ramasubramaniam, brought to limelight a major revision of the traditional Indian planetary model. I would like to request him to place his views, and then we would invite other panelists. Thank you, and over to Dr. M.S. Sriram.
Thank you, Professor Venkateswaran, Dr. Nakul Parashar, and Dr. Ranjana Agarwal. I am not an expert on colonial period science in the sense Professor Deepak Kumar is, who is very done extensive work on that. But I have mostly on ancient Indian astronomy and mathematics. But I am a little familiar with this. I will focus on the advent of modern Western science in India, its limited impact, and the Indian scientists involved during the struggle for independence, though India had a scientific tradition of its own earlier. We know that the three universities in the three presidencies were started in 1857 by the British, but there was no serious attempt to involve the Indians in research or initiative as such by the colonial government, except in some minor secondary roles, in the Trigonometrical Survey of India, in some astronomical observatories, and so on. But many Indians had gone to Britain to study there at college level as well as research, mostly many of them for training for the Indian civil service, but some with a definite motivation to study science and pursue it after returning to India. Prominent among them were the great Jagdish Chandra Bose and Prafulla Chandra Ray. They were born around the same time, around the beginning of 1860s. Both had their BSc, BA kind of education, and also PhD level work in Britain. Both worked in the University of Calcutta after their return by late 1880s and early 1890s. And J.C. Bose's research was original and through his own initiative. That is very important. After learning about Hertz's work on electromagnetic waves, he developed instruments to generate and detect millimeter wave length electromagnetic wave. He demonstrated this publicly in 1894 or 1895 in a park in Kolkata. These are known, and realized that messages can be transmitted through radio waves. Probably due to lack of infrastructure and other supports, he could not develop the radio communication fully. Also, apparently, he was against taking out patents and things like that. And Bose was one of the first to use semiconductor junctions to detect radio waves. So this is amazing at that time. According to Neville Mott, Nobel laureate in 1977 for the contribution to solid state electronics, J.C. Bose was at least 60 years ahead of his time and anticipated the existence of P-type and N-type superconductors, semiconductors. Bose was greatly influenced by Hindu philosophy, and it was perhaps due to this influence that he studied life in plants. See, this is not the kind of work which was going on in Europe or fashionable at all. So it signifies a certain outlook and a certain confidence. J.C. Bose's major contribution in the field of biophysics was the demonstration of the electrical nature of conduction of various stimuli in living beings. He developed an instrument by himself, just as for generation and detection of radio millimeter waves. For this also, for the detecting life in plants, the sismograph, and he found that it is the main this thing. And the conduction was electrical and rather than chemical. And he strongly felt that indigenous scientific research and progress had to be a part of the national life and struggle. And This was realized by Bose and others to follow. Though, of course, direct involvement in any of the struggles was not possible due to their, high degree of involvement in the research work they were doing. Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray's contributions were of a different nature. Even as a student in England, in Britain, he had written an essay on the India before and after the mutiny, somewhat critical of the British Raj. He came back to India around 1889 and established a school of chemistry in the University of Calcutta. He is known for his work in inorganic chemistry, nitrates, nitrous oxide, and so on. He was an influential teacher. Not surprising that he is called Acharya. He was the Acharya of Meghnad Saha, Satyendranath Bose, Mahalani Bis, and many others. And he established Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals. It was initially very successful and developed herbal products. It was founded as an individual initiative by Acharya Rai with the intention of fostering a spirit of entrepreneurship among the Bengali youth and provide an alternative to jobs from the colonial kind of jobs. It is the kind of initiative that colonial government was not that interested at all. There is another great contribution of Acharya Ray, so that is to national spirit and national pride. This was his 2-volume History of India Hindu Chemistry during 1902 to 1910. He had to go through a whole lot of books on Hindu Rasashastras to be able to write a very authentic account of Indian chemistry right from the pre-Harappan period up to some 1600 to 1700 CE. Amazing that he could do it with all his teaching, his research work, his work with Bengal chemicals, and so on. It is still extremely useful reference even now, though some work has been done later, but this is the most extensive work that is available on Indian chemistry before 16th century in the traditional way. Meanwhile, there are some important developments in the establishment of Indian Association for Cultivation of Science in 1876 by Mahendranath Sarkar, who proposed the idea for a national institution for the cultivation of sciences by the natives of India. With a lot of difficulty, it was set up in 1876, but with indifferent support from the British colonial government, and laboratories could only be set up by 1883 only, with the support of Maharaja Vijayanagaram and many others. And no significant scientific research for the next 16 years or so, till C.V. Raman stepped into the scene around 1907 or so. The other development was the strengthening of teaching and research in University of Calcutta and the establishment of University College of Science and Technology, thanks to the efforts of the great Ashutosh Mukherjee. Again, generous contribution from Indians like T.N. Palich and Rashbihari Ghosh was responsible for this. Essence and a historian of science has written that university approached the government for funds, and government flatly refused. The main reason was that T.N. Palich and Rashbihari Ghosh endowments had stipulated that professorships shall always be filled by Indians. So this was their attitude. Meanwhile, Indian Institute of Science had started functioning around 1911 with blessings of Swami Vivekananda and generous support from the Mysore Maharaja, the Mysore government, and the Tatas. People know these things, but interestingly, it had very little to show even after 20 years. There were British professors with very fat salaries, but after 20 years, they had very little to show. This should be noted by people who think that the British government encouraged research and institutions in India. Raman's worked in Indian Association first, and from about 1907 onwards, and then in the University of Calcutta. This is also known. See, Raman had his own priorities and worked according to his own plans, not willing to follow in the footsteps of the European establishment, scientific establishment. He was always interested in all aspects of scattering of light, which eventually led to Raman effect. He did very remarkable work on Indian musical instruments. They had unique properties. He worked on both string instruments and percussion instruments. So he did it in Calcutta in physics research, and his work in physics research was helped by many of his students, many large number of students, including K.S. Krishnan and others. In fact, one of the prominent students was one Venkateshwaran. He had strong views on how science should develop in India. When he was offered the pilot professorship in Calcutta University, one of the stipulations was that he had to be trained in England. Raman refused to go to England to be trained. Finally, the requirement had to be waived, and it is remarkable that this is a very important thing. It's very unlike what we see nowadays, and it's remarkable that whether it is Bose or Raman or Acharya Ray, they developed the instruments to suit what they were in search of. Raman effect instruments are still there. Apparently, Bose's apparatus are still in working condition. And he was, Raman deplored the tendency among students to acquire foreign degrees, while expert knowledge could be easily acquired within the country on all subjects. Around 67 or so, he makes a remark. He says that people should learn the art of thinking independently and find out solutions to problems instead of buying the foreign know-how. Raman shifted to Bangalore as the director of Indian Institute of Science in 1933, but had to resign his directorship in 1937 due to various reasons, but continued as a professor there. And later, after 1948, he had his own Raman Research Institute. Commenting on Indian science in 1920s and 30s, Professor Ramasheshan, nephew and student of Raman, says, later, around 1978 or so, he says, it is the only period when Indian science made a definite impact on the rest of the world. It was the period of men like J.C. Bose, Ramanujan, Raman, S.N. Bose, Meghna Saha, and Birbal Sahni. They were ardent nationalists, consciously or otherwise. They took upon themselves the task of proving to the world that India was a land of intellectual creativity. Regarding their publications, he had very important thing to say. They published their scientific papers in their own journals to establish priority, and to establish priority, they published in Indian journals, and they sent short communications to reputed scientific journals abroad, so that it could acquire the required publicity. The quality of work and references made in foreign journals to Indian journals gave the latter a standing and reputation so good that most scientific laboratories in the world subscribe to journals like Indian Journal of Physics and Proceedings of the Indian Academy of Sciences, Current Science, and Sankhya, and so on. You see which Raman, Mahotsav, etc. are involved. So I have briefly described the work of only Raman, Bose, and Acharya Ray, but there are others. You would have heard of S.N. Bose and Saha and many others. They all thought organized efforts by Indians in the field of science are very important. Probably they were determined to prove that Indians can also do high-level creative science. They were nationalistic, and they felt that their dedicated scientific work and of those taught and trained by them was an important component of the national life, and this was their contribution to the national movement. Any direct involvement in the independence struggle would have been at the cost of the research, though of course they did participate at some level, and perhaps that was their main work, a main framework in which they thought. Their contribution to the world of science was only a small component of the science of those days, with limited infrastructure, with limited support, but with immense confidence. At least one Nobel laureate emerged from within India, the first Asian to get a Nobel laureate in science, and many others with distinct, lasting contributions. But we don't have even that much of a success after so many years of independence, with so many universities and research institutes, with vast improvements in infrastructure, and with far more international collaborations. And we don't have successful journals with reasonable impact published from India. Our important scientists, fellows of academies, award winners, rarely published in Indian journals. And somehow the work abroad, PhD abroad, international collaborations, they are given excessive importance. And it's not, I'm not trying to decry any of these, or, I know that, we are all aware that international collaborations are becoming very important, and scenario has changed, both in the so-called developing countries and developing countries. But is there any instance of a nation becoming a science power without a very strong local base, local institutions, and local journals? I think we have to ponder over that. Thank you all for giving me an opportunity to present some of my views. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sriram. It was a very wonderful initiation for this panel discussion. All the viewers who are watching this program through social media, particularly YouTube and India Science, please, in the comment section, you can raise some questions to the panelists in general or to a specific panelist. Please raise your questions or comments over there. We will pick it up. And now I would move on to our next panelist, Professor M.D. Srinivas. He is currently the chairman of Center for Policy Studies, Chennai. He was formerly a faculty at the Department of Theoretical Physics, University of Madras. And since 2013, he is a member of Indian National Commission for History of Science of the Indian National Science Academy. And along with his theoretical physics research, his area of expertise include scientific and technological tradition of India. Sir, the floor is yours. Please, your intervention in this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Venkateshwaran. It's indeed wonderful that Vigyan Prasad and Vigyan Bharati are organizing a series of discussions on the role of Indian scientists in the Indian independence movement, especially in the context of the coming 75th year of Indian independence. Professor Sriram has covered a large ground, so I will try to present a little bit of the perspective. About 50 years ago, a great Gandhian historian and thinker, Sri Dharampal, whose centenary is being celebrated next year, he brought out a seminal work, Indian Science and Technology in the 18th Century, Some Contemporary European Accounts. A decade later, he also brought out a landmark publication on the indigenous Indian educational system, The Beautiful Tree, Indigenous Indian Education in 18th Century. Contrary to the kind of views that dominate the scholarly discourse even today, these and other works of Sri Dharampal have provided us with a graphic account of the 18th century Indian society, a society that was fairly advanced in its sciences and technologies, as well as the supporting educational, political, economic institutions and arrangements. Recent work of modern economic historians have also shown that in the 18th century, India produced over 25% of the world manufacturing output. It was the largest exporter of textiles, and it is said that India clothed the world, and so on. All this was to change drastically in the course of over 100 years of British rule, so that towards the latter half of the 19th century, most of the Indian educated classes, as well as the British administrators, were convinced that Indian society had been economically impoverished and scientifically and technologically backward for millennia. To cite an example, Sir Richard Temple, the governor of Bengal, wrote to the Viceroy, Earl of Northbrook, on February 18, 1875. Quotation. No doubt, the alumni of our schools and colleges do become, as a class, discontent. But this arises partly from our higher education being too much in the direction of law, public administration, and prose literature, where they may possibly imagine, however erroneously, that they may approach to compete with us. That's the British. But we shall do more and more to direct their thoughts towards practical science, where they must inevitably feel their utter inferiority to us. This is Sir Richard Temple. It was with such expectations that Sir Richard went on to inaugurate the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science, which was founded by the dedicated efforts of Mahendralal Sarkar and his friends in 1876, 1 year after this letter. There were indeed several British efforts to promote science and technology in India, starting with the establishment of the Asiatic Society in 1784. In fact, even the surveys, one of which started, the Survey of India started in 1767 itself. It was most important for military purposes. The Great Trigonometric Survey in 1801, the Geological Survey in 1851, and so on. The starting of the British educational system after the Macaulay Minute in 1835 onwards. The establishment of the universities and presidency colleges in Kolkata, Mumbai and Chennai after the First War of Independence in 1858, etc. However, we should not forget that all these British efforts were directed at promoting the British imperial interests of administration, commerce, and more than anything else, of keeping the Indians subjugated in body and spirit. A fair number of Indians also participated in all these institutions as scientists and technologists, although in a subordinate capacity, both in their status as well as in their emoluments. The native scientists, as they were called, enjoyed little freedom to innovate and had to work under very humiliating conditions. Still, many of these Indians did distinguish themselves by their meticulous work and contributions in diverse areas. Now, with the growth of national consciousness among the educated classes towards the end of 19th century, India also was blessed with some extremely gifted and patriotic scientists who devoted their entire life and all their resources for national resurgence in science and technology. Their agenda was very different from the agenda of the British created institutions. Their agenda was mainly the following. Different scientists pursued different aspects of this agenda, but most of them, in fact, had something to do with each and every one of these. Establish institutions for doing original research and development in science and technology, which are directed towards national reconstruction and to re-establish the dignity and standing of India in the modern world. To establish that from ancient times, India has been a civilization of high attainments in sciences and technologies. To educate the Indian people about the attainments of Indian civilization in science and technology, and also about the role of India in contemporary developments in science and technology. And finally, to explore how India can re-establish itself as a leader in the world of science and technology once again, based on its own glorious traditions of science and technology, along with suitable inputs from modern developments in science and technology in the West. In fact, we have not yet comprehensively documented how many of these great scientists, such as J.C. Bose, P.C. Ray, S. Ramanujan, C.V. Raman, and a number of others have contributed to this great movement of national resurgence, which may call as the movement for Swaraj in science and technology. We also need to extensively document how several distinguished public figures such as Jamshedji Tata, Sri Madan Mohan Malaviya, or many others, including several enlightened rulers of princely states, determinedly promoted this cause of resurgence in science and technology with all their resources and support. We should also popularize the great achievements of these great scientists and public figures in our school curricula to evoke the nationalist spirit of Swaraj in science and technology, which is indeed a prerequisite for nation building and re-establishment of India's standing in the world of science and technology. Here, I shall cite only a few instances in addition to what Professor Sriram has already cited on the seminal contributions of some of our great scientists, for the cause of national resurgence through science and technology during the time of our independence movement. Professor Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray has already been discussed his life and his great contribution. He could not participate in the Swadeshi movement because he was teaching in the government college. But after he joined university as a Pallet professor of chemistry in 1916, Acharya Ray very actively participated in the independence movement and all its struggles. Let's quickly go to Srinivas Ramanujan. We all know about his great work in mathematics. Now, the Indian Mathematical Society was just formed in 1907. They started a journal in 1909. It was Ramanujan's first 5 papers and 23 questions and answers that he published in this journal during 1911 to 1913. He also published 7 more papers after he went to England and some more questions and answers in this journal. And this is what contributed in a major way to the prestige of this journal, an Indian journal. We all know that Ramanujan's notebooks comprised of the work he had done before going to England in 1914. They contained around 3,250 results. Now, the way Ramanujan understood the work that he did in England in comparison to the work that he did before going there, to understand that, there is a letter from him that he wrote to his friend Krishna Rao in November 1914, within 5-6 months of reaching England. He says, quote, "I changed my plan of publishing my results. I am not going to publish any of the old results in my notebook till the war is over. After coming here, I have learned some of their methods. I am trying to get new results by their methods so that I can easily publish these results without delay." So he clearly separated his work earlier and he wanted to publish all of them after he returned to India. In late 1918, the Madras government offered a grant of £250 a year to Ramanujan. On receipt of this communication, he wrote to the registrar that after meeting his basic expenses, the surplus should be used for some educational purpose, such in particular as reduction of school fees for poor boys and orphans and provisions of books in schools. We have always heard of Ramanujan's asking for money. Here we see him generously donating money for a national cause. It's indeed unfortunate that Indian mathematicians did not organize their research and teaching activities with a view to carrying forward the great legacy of Ramanujan. In January 1921, Professor K. Anandarao, who was also a student at Cambridge around the time Ramanujan was there, he sends all the notebooks of Ramanujan and papers, along with what later on became famous as the Lost Notebook. By sending it, Anandarao writes to Hardy, "You will have noticed also in the minutes that the syndicate has asked Mr. Sheshu Iyer and me to arrange for the preparation of a transcript of Ramanujan's notebook with a view to having it incorporated in the memorial volume. I do not know if this will serve any useful purpose. I fear it may look a little incongruous by the side of his mature work," by which Anandarao means the work done in England in collaboration with Hardy and Littlewood. "But there are some here who think that the notebook may contain valuable algorithms providing starting points for future investigation." Anandarao was indeed a very distinguished mathematician, but unfortunately this was his understanding of Ramanujan's work. In fact, all that the Indian mathematics community could do about these notebooks was to print a facsimile edition without any editorial comment, and the edition was printed just to make the books available to the international mathematical community. In fact, even today, when there is a lot of global interest in pursuing Ramanujan's work, there are few courses on Ramanujan's work taught in our institutions of higher learning. There are not many popular accounts of his work. There is only a biography written by a European. And it nowhere forms a part of our school curricula. About Raman, Sri Ram has covered a very large ground. We only need to mention one thing, that he founded the Indian Academy of Science in 1933. That story itself is very interesting. because the British insisted the Academy of Sciences should have equal number of British fellows and Indian fellows. And Raman said, I do not want to have an academy where 15 of our great scientists are discussing under the supervision of 15 British scientists. So he wrote an unsigned editorial, an Indian Academy of Science, in the Current Science, a journal he started in May 1933. They are very interesting things. I urge all of you to go and read this. But one important point I will just say. India will have to organize and develop her national scientific institutions before she can enter into the Committee of International Scientists. The achievements of Indian science are national assets, and an academy which treasures and displays them collectively is assured of providing the necessary guidance and inspirations for the younger generation to put forth greater exertions in order to enrich and widen the usefulness of this great estate. He was very keen that Indians should publish in the Indian journals. And he said, while science the spirit and service of science is international, the institutions and the journals, the magazines have to be run on a national scale to showcase and to inspire the other countrymen, to showcase the achievements of the nation. 2 days before he died, Raman is supposed to have told one of his students, do not allow the journals of the academy to die, for they are the sensitive indicators of the quality of science being done in the country and whether science is taking root or not. Raman has written extensively on his approach to scientific research. Here is an address that he is giving to students in Colombo in 1946. Inspiration for science, like all arts, was Mother Nature. We in India have been brought up to look for inspiration from the West. We have past glories of our own, and I do not think for a moment we will ever rise to the full height of nationhood unless we stop looking for inspiration from the West and unless we start seeking inspiration in the history of our own land with its glories of the past. There was a great movement for resurgence of Ayurveda in this country in the first half of 20th century. In fact, the Indian National Congress had a resolution in its 1920 session that schools, colleges, hospitals for instruction and treatment in accordance with indigenous systems should be established. The surge of national consciousness and widespread social support were the forces behind the resurgence of Ayurveda. Several colleges and associations were started, companies for production of drugs. All these were started in this period. But independent India has failed to harness the great resources of the Ayurvedic system and the large number of Vaidyas also in our national healthcare system in a suitable synergic forum with the modern Western medical system. In stark contrast, the Chinese seem to have made great strides in the use of traditional Chinese medicine in synergy with the modern Western medical system. This has led to a Nobel Prize for a traditional Chinese anti-malarial drug. And recently, much of the success of China in responding to the COVID pandemic has been attributed to this synergy. To conclude, I would like to emphasize the fact that it's very unfortunate that this national spirit that was evinced by many great scientists during the independence movement seems to have quickly evaporated soon after independence. In fact, today we have reached a point where a large number of scientists, around 900 of them recently, they can formally address the Prime Minister declaring Atmanirbharata and referring to the idea in sarcastic terms. In fact, we seem to have come a very long way from the Purna Swaraj pledge of January 26, 1930, which was drafted by Mahatma Gandhi. That pledge declared that British rule had destroyed India politically, economically, culturally, and spiritually. We have attained political Swaraj, but are still in the process of attaining Swaraj in other domains. Of course, Mahatma Gandhi himself said in 1947 that it may take us 75 years to recover from the 150 years of British rule. Now that we are about to complete 75 years after independence, we should resolve to do everything possible to regain our economic, cultural and spiritual Swaraj, at least in the next 2 decades. For this, understanding the work of these great scientists during the independence movement would be a pointer for all of us. I thank you once again for giving me this opportunity. Namaskar.
Thank you, Professor MD Sinifa, for this excellent initial presentation. So now I'll move on to our next speaker, I would invite Professor Venni V. Krishna. He is currently professorial fellow at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. And he was formerly a professor in science policy at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and also editor-in-chief of Science, Technology and Society International Journal. Dr. V.V. Krishna, floor is yours, please.
Yeah. Can I get, yeah, thank you. At the outset, let me thank Vigyan Bharati and Vigyan Prasar, Dr. Nakul Parashar, Dr. Venkateshwaran, and also Dr. Arvind Ranade. We had, and Dr. Anjana Agarwal. We had two excellent presentations by Professor Sriram and Srinivas, which gives some kind of a background to the what I'm going to also talk about. And so let me begin by getting into my talk. Can we have the next slide, please? Can we have the next slide?
सर स्लाइड आपको ही चेंज करना, आपके एंड से है प्लीज.
Okay. Yeah. Let me begin with colonialism and Indian case. If we compare French, Spanish, Dutch, British colonialism in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, India stands out as a unique case. French in Africa, the whole French colonialism's objective was to have a civilizational mission. At the end of the French colonialism, there was almost an empty space for science in the French Africa. For example, there were only 4 agronomists in the whole of Africa in the 1960s. Latin American countries got independence around 1826, almost about more than 100 years before India, but no major developments of local independent science traditions came about till 1950s or 1960s. Also because of the reason that Spain was not a very great science power compared to Britain and some of the other countries. So creating a base for independent science tradition was very much a part and parcel of India's political struggle for independence and its national movement from the 1880s. In India, the development of independent science tradition and emergence of national science in parallel to colonial science came about during 1880s and 1930s, and we had number of examples from Professor Sriram and Professor Srinivas. I am using two concepts. One is the concept of national science and national science community. National science is basically...
Krishna, can I suggest one thing if you don't mind? Huh?
Yeah.
If you go to your PowerPoint, I mean, in the slideshow, I mean, after home, you have insert, design, transition, animation, and slideshow. There you can click and then go for full screen on the top ribbon, file, home, insert, that slideshow. Below that, there is slideshow. In that slideshow, you can click the slideshow.
Yeah, is okay?
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you. That's nice. Thank you.
Okay. So the concept of national science and the national science community. National science, I'm using only the term national is only being used as a kind of a nation building. And the concept of scientific community, it is not the buildings, it is not the money, it is not the other kind of the resources, but what is also important is also the intellectual advancement of knowledge, the whole professionalization of the science. Now, if you look in terms of Indian colonial context, around 1876, you will find a breakaway from the colonial science. We all know Professor Deepak Kumar has immensely contributed, and he will definitely talk about the colonial science. There was a whole lot of colonial science which was already mentioned. But the colonial science has there was a break in the colonial science towards the end of the 19th century. Several Indian scientists and engineers returning from UK and Europe found themselves frustrated in the provincial education service without labs and a lack of sense of intellectual community in science. So this was the time. 1876 is also the beginning of the period when the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science was established. This was also the period of the national movement, and you will find that National Council of Education was created in 1906, which led to a series of developments in Bengal, which led to the whole national awakening in science and education. For example, if we look into the kind of the objectives of Mahendralal Sarkar, and I quote, he said, "We should endeavor to carry out the work with our own efforts, unaided by the government. I want it to be entirely under the management and control. I want it to be solely native and purely national." So the term national, what I'm trying to use is as the term interpretatively I'm using as it was used by Mahendralal Sarkar, J.C. Bose, and many others, P.C. Ray, in number of ways. So the term national is used in a very, very limited sense in terms of the whole nation building, creating an identity of science within the international sphere of science at that particular point of time. So between 1870s and 1914, some basic institutions outside the colonial science enterprises were created. Outside the colonial enterprises, basically, relatively, I'm talking in terms of outside these, many of these colonial enterprises, whether it is Botanical Survey of India, Geological Survey of India, there were almost a dozen colonial scientific enterprises. And these colonial scientific enterprises was basically gatekeeping in the science. It will allow science to be pursued at certain level and stop at certain levels of professionalization. Between 1914 and 1940s, the national science led to formation of Indian science community. So I will come down to the period between 1914 and 1940s is very important in terms of the whole Indian social history of science. And how did this come about? I will argue from a socio-historical perspective, basically giving a sociological explanation. Now, if you ask a question that within the colonial context, who was a colonial scientist? And if you look in terms of the whole number of scientists working in the colonial context, and if you do a kind of a stratification in the colonial science around 1920s, you will come down to three categories of people. The first category of the people, sociologically, you can call them as the gatekeepers. There's a number of people like Sir Thomas Holland, who was head of the Geological Survey of India, who would maintain the status quo of the colonial science. You have Medlicott, who was also the head of the science enterprises, who had number of racial overtones. The second category, we had people like William O'Shaughnessy, William Pole, Alexander Strange. William O'Shaughnessy comes to India, in 1820 as a professor. Between 1857 and 1861, he was a marvelous person. He was given the whole responsibility for laying 11,000 miles of telegraphy. Remember 1857, they call it mutiny and we call it First War of Independence. So after the work, he gets back to Britain. So all the experience which was gained in the country was lost to India. William Pole is another colonial scientist who was engineering at the Elephantstone Bombay College at Bombay, held the great survey Indian Railways. On his return to England, he was employed in railway engineering and consulted by D. Lesseps on the proposed to dig a canal in the Suez. The other colonial scientist, who I call soldier, Alexander Strange, returning to England from Trigonometrical Survey of India 1861, established a large department of scientific instruments and for inspection. Strange was elected to the Fellow of the Royal Society, and Nature in 1876 observed that to him belongs the credit appointed Royal Commission in Scientific Institution and Advancement of the Science. So basically what you have is people like Alexander Strange, William O'Shaughnessy, and William Pole, who excellent scientists who would do a lot of work. They spent 8 to 9 to 10 years in this country, gained a lot of experience, and they were given certain tasks, and when the task is over, they will get back to the Britain, and all the experience which was acquired in the country is simply lost. So the first category, we have the gatekeepers like Sir Thomas Holland, who would and Medlicott, who would allow science to come up to certain level. Maybe the survey research, maybe there's a whole data gathering activity like Roy McLeod talks about. In the second category, we have excellent people, the soldiers, but they acted just like soldiers. They were given certain tasks, they finished their task and they went back. In the third category of scientists, we have the native plus supporters. Remember, there were not only the natives like P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose, Mahendralal Sarkar, and a number of other Indian scientists, but there were also some foreign scientists. For instance, in the third category, we had David Harry, who was the founder of the Hindu College, who dies in India, Father Lafont, who was established the St. Xavier College, Samuelson, who was founder of the Indian Science Congress Association. So there were a number of Indians and the Europeans were there in that. It is the third category of the scientists which were very important for establishing what is known as the national science and the Indian science community. In terms of the gatekeeping, we had Asiatic Society of Bengal. Actually, Asiatic Society of Bengal was open only to the Britishers, so only to the Europeans. Dwaratna Tagore could become a member only after 50 years of the establishment of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. So there was a kind of a gatekeeping activity was there. P.N. Bose case, classic case is there, the Geological Survey of India, where he wanted to do research on iron ore. He was not allowed. His GSI would do only research on the coal. P.N. Bose was overtaken by Sir Thomas Holland, though he was much more qualified as the head of the GSI. Later on, P.N. Bose joins the Tatas and the steel industry comes into the being. Another example of racial discrimination is given by the Medlicott, who later on becomes the head of the Geological Survey of India. He says, and I quote, "Indians are incapable of any original work in natural science." He wanted to wait till the scientific chord among the natives was touched, added that if indeed it exists as yet in this variety of human race, so let us exercise a little discretion with our weakened brethren and not expect them to run before they can walk. So this was the kind of the racial overtones within the colonial science. And you will find also many of the Indian scientists, with the exception of the J.C. Bose, who were in the provincial educational services, were paid half the salaries what paid to the kind of the British scientists. The first degree in science was established only in 1898, though the universities were created in 1857. There are 3 universities in the presidencies. So the Imperial Education Service versus the Provincial Education Service, there's a whole lot of conflict is there. Mostly Indian scientists were placed in the PES. Science surveys created professional technicians, but stopped at the doors of the professionalization and advancement of science and the knowledge. So there was a whole division of labor between the center and the periphery, where you do much of the colonial scientific enterprises would do only the survey research and data gathering activity and a kind of an applied research, but the basic research and the synthesis will go on in the Britain. So that was the kind of the division of the labor which was there. Now that breaks with there's a break in the colonial science towards the late 19th century, as I already mentioned, from 1876 with the establishment of the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science. Of course, till Raman joins in 1907, the real research doesn't pick up at the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science. But between 1876 and 1920s, Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, and there were a number of support structures were created for the national science. There were a whole lot of thousands and thousands of science books were translated into science, because given the kind of the language problem was there in terms of modern science. The number of scientific societies were created. The Bihar Scientific Society, Aligarh Scientific Society, Deepak's classic book on science and the colonial has a number of these details and the data. The popular lectures which were given by a number of people like from the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, there was a whole lot of popularization of science. I'm not going into the whole details. So between 1876 and 1920s, the whole lot of support structures were created. Many of these support structures in science, in terms of translation, scientific societies, in terms of the national science, outside the colonial scientific enterprises. From 1857 to 1918, the whole lot of universities were created, but among the universities, 6 universities at Allahabad, Punjab, Banaras, Mysore, Patna, Osmania, and 45 colleges. These were mostly the universities with Indian contribution, which was quite substantial, about nearly 80%. So there was a whole lot of the support structures which were created by 1918 or 1920. Between 1914 and 1930s, we will find that the Indian Science Congress Association, led to proliferation of 28 science societies, and by 1930s with these journals. These 28 science societies which were created at the Indian Science Congress Association played a dominant role in terms of inaugurating what is known as the Indian Chemical Society, Indian Botanical Society. There was a whole lot of the scientific societies which were created where comes out of the Indian Science Congress Association. And by the 1930s, and many of these societies have launched journals. So what Indian Science Congress Association has done between 1914 and 1930s or 1940s is basically provide a kind of a very big intellectual platform outside the colonial scientific colonial enterprises, so that the annual sessions of the Indian Science Congress Association, where some of the leading Indian politicians and the scientists met together, and this is the place where there was a kind of a close alliance or the close network between the science and the politics has developed. So what happens by the 1930s is that already Professor Sriram and Professor Srinivas has made number of important points. Something like P.C. Ray and Associates have created Indian School of Chemistry. You see, there was a whole lot of number of chemists were there. C.V. Raman and M.N. Saha was responsible for what is known as the Indian School of Physics. J.C. Bose in the plant physiology and the electromagnetic waves. Father Lafont created the astronomy and solar observations when the 4 observatories were created at St. Xavier Institute. Ashutosh Mukherjee and other associates have created the Indian School of Mathematics. By 1930s, one can identify Indian science community within the international sphere of the science. And by 1940s, I think the 8 fellows of the Royal Society were there. This is just an example. I am just showing the Indian School of Chemistry. I could have gone with the details of other Indian Physics School, Indian Mathematics School. Now, what this table shows is from P.C. Ray, from 1894 till about 1920, you will find almost 20 leading chemistry professors. There were in many of their P.C. Ray's associates. They were in the chemistry departments in all over the country. And on the third column, you will find the number of publications, and the last column, the number of the researchers. So Indian School of Chemistry, this is basically a kind of a snapshot which I am using for one particular to show as an example. So what you will find by 1930s and the 1940s is also a kind of a alliance between science and the politics, which was inaugurated by Nehru, to quote him, he said in 1938 at the Indian Science Congress, "It is science alone that could solve these problems of hunger and poverty, of sanitation and illiteracy, of superstition, deadening custom, and tradition of vast resources running to waste of a rich country inhabited by starving people." So, so in terms of the whole my presentation, what I'm trying to present is basically that what is known as the kind of the Indian science community, or the whole emergence of what is known as the national science, was created outside the colonial enterprises by 1930s or 1940s. Between 1920s and the 1940s. This is a kind of a big criticism to the Basala, who said that, who reckoned, who wrote a classic paper on the colonial science and in the journal Nature, and who termed many of the countries like India and many of the colonial countries which were under the British colonialism as non-science societies. So what Indians have done, which is unique to the other colonial countries, is within the colonial context, though colonialism persisted till 1947. So even before that, between 1880s and the 1930s, you will find an independent science tradition emerging and established relatively outside the colonial scientific enterprises. So this is a kind of a critique of Basalas. So from the cultural point of view, they also subscribe to the whole view that the modern science is not alien to the Indian culture. The epistemological roots of modern science can be traced to the Indian tradition in the ancient, in the medieval times. As we already heard, that P.C. Ray had written 2 volumes of history of Hindu chemistry in 1907 and 1906. He just used the term Hindu. Hindu is nothing to do with any kind of a political connotation. The whole purpose was to show to the Europeans that there is a chemical tradition which is running from the modern science to the medieval and to the medieval India. So there is a whole kind of the roots of the modern science can be traced into the whole ancient and the medieval times. And the national science means it is a nation building and the Indian identity within the global science, and nothing more and nothing less than that. P.C. Ray was very, very careful not to glorify the past. He is very dangerous, he said, and it spoils the image of the Indian scientific contribution in the world. Whatever credit we need to give to the kind of our own traditions. It is very, very important, nothing more and nothing less. So something like Indian science community emerged by 1930s. Nehru's imprint on the science and technology for development is already there. The close alliance between science and politics you will find between 1930s and 1960s. Nehru, one of the other point I want to make in terms of the whole elite science and the present day situation is the Nehru allowed a lot of dissent and a lot of criticism about the science. For example, you can take Saha. Saha was very close to Nehru, and Saha was very instrumental in bringing Nehru as the chair of the National Planning Committee in 1930s. Actually, it was Saha was asked to take over, but Saha said there should be a political person. But he was very close to Nehru and supported the government on a number of occasions. But at the same time, he had a lot of problems with the kind of the Nehruvian model of the science and technology, and he contests a Congress as an independent from the Calcutta and sits in the parliament against the Congress, but supports at the international level and supports Nehru on many of the occasions when he differed on many of these things in terms of the whole Nehruvian model and the A.V. Hill model. That's a different kind of the whole story. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Nehru allowed a lot of dissent and a lot of criticism in terms of the scientific elite scientists who were there. So he laid a long-standing foundations for the basic science and for the base for innovation. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. That was a very wonderful walkthrough on the emergence of modern scientific institution, and as you pointed out, the science community in India. Thank you for it. And then I'll invite our next panelist, Dr. Deepak Kumar. Dr. Deepak Kumar was formerly a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University on history of science and education. He is a historian specializing in history of science and technology in India. His book, Science and the Raj, a study of British in India, is seminal work in this area, and I invite him for his talk. Your floor, please. Thank you. You have to unmute yourself before you start talking. Dr. Kumar, you have to unmute yourself before you start talking. Yeah. No, 1 second, you are muted.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I'm grateful to my fellow panelists, very eminent. They have made my job very, very easy because they have presented in great detail most of the things. I shall rather confine myself to explanation, to explain certain terms which we use very frequently. And for example, one is colonialism. Professor Krishna talked about it. He gave a comparative perspective also, French, British, and others. Second term, very important term, independence. This is what we are celebrating, 75th year. And another very important term is freedom. Then most of the time, using British records, we use the term native. And then Swadeshi. This is also a very significant term. So let me first begin with giving some basic, talking some basic notions about these four terms. For example, colonialism, we all we know about it. It has been a very powerful historical force which has shaped us as nothing else had done during last 3 centuries. It had taken my language. I'm talking to you in a language which is neither my mother tongue nor your mother tongue, but that is the weight of near history. That's the weight of last 2 centuries or so. Colonialism, to explain it in very simple fashion, maybe in equation form, is something like this. A tells B that he knows B better than B knows himself, and therefore he has the right to legislate, to rule over B. This is what they did. This is what the British, the French, or the Dutch, or Portugals, they did. Some did it with brute force, some did it with some force, some persuasion, and so forth. Now, British were very intelligent people. They used brute force, East India Company period, even later. But at the same time, they had this carrot and stick policy. So there were some gains, lot of loss. There is no doubt about it. So colonialism is basically a machine, a brute machine, highly exploitative. It had to be. Colonialism is no philanthropy, sir. Even today, it is not philanthropy. We have neo-colonialism. We have all kinds of, Even in a democratic setup, you have dominance. What do you do? Extreme dominance. The idea that I am always right and the others are wrong. What do you do? So that's a very problematic term, and we need to keep it in mind that this colonialism is not really dead even now, after 70 years of independence. Second, we frequently use the term native. Even ordinary conversation, you are native of Andhra, you are native of this. Now, we should realize native has a pejorative connotation. An Englishman in England never calls himself native of England. No, he's not a native. He calls my languages vernacular. He never calls English vernacular. English is English. while Tamil and Hindi are vernaculars. How could it be? Third is a very interesting term, Swadeshi. Swa means self. Swa is very important. Swa also talks about identity, self-identity. And self is not selfishness. Self is not one individual. Individual represents society. Society represents individuals. Self is a huge. It all depends how you cultivate self, how you perceive self. So swa bahut mahatvapurna. Swa. Swadesh, Swadeshi, Swabhav, and all kinds of. It's very, very philosophically very significant. The term independence is also very significant. You know, the first time the term, sometime in late 19th century, you come across this term. Because earlier, under East India Company rule, the term independence had to be very, it was difficult. Indian middle class found it difficult to formulate on it. But they did deliberate upon it. I will come to it a little later. But during 20th century, the term independence and freedom became interchangeable. So we call our independence movement freedom movement also. Freedom movement, independent movement, both interchangeable. But there are subtle differences that one should keep in mind. Independence has more political connotation, while freedom can be freedom from poverty, from diseases. Look, epidemics right now raging in our country, how much we have lost. We need freedom from that. So freedom, independence, we need to keep it in mind, the subtle distinction, and their special characteristics. Patriotism is everywhere. In national movement as well as in freedom movement. Okay. Then the term national, very significant word. And a lot of discussion has taken over it. I don't know whether our Shastras discussed it in ancient times. I know very little. I would like my friends to enlighten me on. National word, I was struck when I read a pamphlet by Dr. Mahendralal Sarkar, written in 1869. He called it desirability of a national institution in terms of science, of course. When I read this, was a remarkable pamphlet. I read it 40 years ago. Remarkable pamphlet. And he uses the term national. Desirability of a national. What did he mean by national? Now, here was a medical professional who was impressed with the utility of science, with the desirability of science, scientific development, who was a direct witness to what was happening at that time in Europe in terms of Pasteurian revolution, in terms of germ theory, in terms of Darwinian revolution, and so forth. So he was a living witness to. And he had a medical degree from Calcutta Medical College, but he shifted to homeopathy. He was an iconoclast. He could differ. And he had a good knowledge of the Indian tradition. He was very close to Ramakrishna Paramhans. He used to argue with him. He treated him also when Paramhans was suffering physical ailment. So they were so close. And they just, now this term national is very significant, which Mahendralal Sarkar uses. I haven't come across this term earlier, maybe in, say, in the writings of Akshay Kumar Datto or Ram Mohan Roy or Vidyasagar and so forth. No. They were, of course, trying to assert their own cultural identity, no doubt about it. Ram Mohan Roy, known as the father of modernity, but modern India, but he was basically a synthesizer. He was synthesizing our ancient traditions with what was coming from the West together. There were many others who were trying to grapple with this crisis of synthesis. But it was Mahendralal Sarkar who tried to give an institutional shape to this dilemma. And he uses two crucial terms. One, of course, national. The other term is cultivation. Science is to be cultivated. We need to, it's so significant even now. Science needs to be cultured. We talk of scientific temper. If it is not scientific temper, then what it is? Without using the term scientific temper, Mahendralal Sarkar was talking about it. Cultivate. Cultivate what? In the spirit. Cultivation, like a pageant, it has to be cultivated. This institution still functions. It's in Kolkata. And later, you will see, thanks to the seed sown by these people, that you have a new dawn in our thinking. So you have a number of people whose names had just been reeled out, J.C. Bose, Ramasanath Bose, Acharya Praful Chandra Ray. There are a few names which you could have also, they could have mentioned, is Ravindra Sundar Trivedi. He was a teacher of physics, but he wanted to have the benefit of both. He was struggling with the idea of what to retain from Indian philosophical and historical tradition and what to reject. And he didn't want to lose his own ground. Even Ramasanath Bose didn't want to lose his ground. His 3-volume History of Hindu Civilization is a remarkable testimony of his anxiety. You have Rogin Seal, early 20th century. In fact, there are many books those days which came up. K.P. Jaisawal's Hindu Polity. Positive Sciences of the Ancient Hindus, etc. Many. So this was a remarkable period on which I don't want to go back because of paucity of time, and Professor Krishna and Mr. Ram have talked about it. There are a few names which we missed. For example, Ashutosh Mukhopadhyay. He was known to be a government man, but in truth, he was a fiercely independent person. Fiercely, a great mathematician in his own right. But at the same time, he ran Calcutta University in the best of national interest, not in British interest. And once, sometime in 1923 or so, after the post-First World War, British government cut the grants of Calcutta University. He roared like a lion. He said, no. Teachers will retain their freedom. They will not bow to the government even if you cut our funds. Today, how many vice chancellors have this guts? They should learn from Ashutosh Mukherjee. He opened the doors of Calcutta University. He brought Sir C.V. Raman. Universities, by definition, should be universal. Professor Ashutosh Mukherjee practiced it. Today, most of our universities are regional, they are local. Appointing only local people. Open to, I don't know. You know it better. Anyway, we need to learn from Professor Ashutosh. This is what our independence ethos was, independence movement ethos was. He founded the Indian Science Congress. Though it was dominated by the British scientists of different government departments like Geological Survey, Botanical Survey, Agriculture Department, etc., there were many Indians who were encouraged to participate in the Indian Science Congress, which laid an important foundation of what Professor Krishna calls scientific community. We had the example of, at that time, people like Hakim Ajmal Khan and P.S. Varya, Puttakan, Aryavedishala. They were also searching for a new identity. They were trying to synthesize. P.S. Varya moves miles ahead and experiments on medicine. It's still a successful enterprise, while Hakim Ajmal Khan was a noted educationist. He established, which is today CSIR, CDRI in Lucknow, and of course the Tibia College. Jamia Millia in Delhi, he established. And these were the people who went beyond their time, and from whom we need to learn as part of our national movement. We have a number of other great scientists who worked for the government. For example, Dr. Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar. Even if he worked for the government, he was a nationalist to the core. He was the first director of Board of Scientific Industrial Research, which today is known as CSIR, Council of Scientific Industrial Research. And what kind of people these were? Can you imagine? You know, he was a professor of chemistry at Punjab University, Lahore, and he did some work for an oil company in Attock, which gave him a reward of 3 lakh rupees in 35 years. And this man, Dr. Bhatnagar, donates it to his own department, chemistry department. Can you imagine anyone today donating even 3 rupees? No. This was the nationalist spirit. The spirit of people who didn't want to go abroad for PhD, like Satyen Bose, Meghnad Saha, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan for their PhD. No. They valued Calcutta University more, their own university more. Earlier, some had gone, P.C. had gone, and Professor Bose had gone abroad. But even in Edinburgh, he was writing pamphlets talking about national movement, asking for more scientific education, asking for technology, etc., etc. We had other names, apart from S.S. Bhatnagar. We had Homi Bhabha, a great institutional. We had Birbal Sahni. You know, he wore Tupalia topi, and you know, he was a staunch nationalist. In fact, many people in British establishment, Royal Society didn't like him. But here was a paleontologist of great importance, and he talked. His ancestor Ruchiram Sahni, on which Vigyan Prasad has published book also. And they were the people who were much ahead of their time, contributed to national movement, contributed to. Now, in the proceedings of the Indian National Congress, right from 1985-86, you will see there are always talk about technical education, scientific education, public health, medicine, etc. I have gone through all the resolutions from 1885 down to 50 or so, and there you will find that our national leaders, how conscious they were. And this is where you find the notion of freedom, more than independence. Freedom, which meant freedom from poverty. Freedom, which meant freedom from illiteracy. Which meant, you know, Indians exercising power for the benefit of their own society. Upliftment of the society. Earlier, British government used terms like improvement. You know, in 19th century, the term was improvement. Improving the moral and material condition of the British. ठीक है भाई, improve करो. But it was right from 1920s that the term development comes in. Dr. Vishwesvaraya talks about planning and development. Bombay Group in 1942 talks about, in its own way. You may agree with it, you may differ with this prescription. Meghnad Saha talked about it in National Planning Committee, and his famous journal, 1934, which established Science and Culture. You go through the editorials of Science and Culture, and you see the spirit of both independence and freedom alive. Nowhere else you will see this. These were people with deep social commitment. You may differ with his many things. Some people agreed with para, some didn't agree with para, apara. ये चलता रहा मेहनलाल सरकार से लेके आज तक. Whether we have a spiritual tradition or not a spiritual tradition, a material tradition, and this kind of analysis, that kind of analysis, has been part of our growth, of our development, intellectual development. But we allowed discussions to take place, debates to come out, different points of view coming out. Tagore, a totally modern person. And he is spiritual, no one can deny his spirituality. But still he is pro-science, pro-technology, strongly pro-science, pro-technology. He differs with even Gandhi. Differs with Gandhi very strongly on many points. Vivekananda, who reestablishes the value of Vedanta and our philosophy, our great tradition, always talked in terms of, he encouraged Jamshedji Tata to establish Indian Institute of Science. These were eternal modern people, pro-science, pro-technology, and they were aware of the pitfalls, but still they wanted. So our people participate. They discussed about independence and freedom, both. They wanted to find out, to lay down a blueprint of what independent India should be. You go through any number of debates right from 1920 to 1950, you will find such people. You will find people, even popularizers like C.Y. Chintamani, legislator like Muthuswami Reddy, Madras Legislative Assembly. If you go through the Legislative Assembly debates of Northwest, Punjab, Bombay Presidency and Bengal Presidency, as well as Central Assembly in Delhi, you see how alive they were. Even those who didn't understand science, or who didn't, who cannot be called scientists, how they talked in terms of science, how alive they were. So most of these things can be, well, I think I should stop. Time must be up. My apologies for taking your time, but I'm grateful for the opportunity. This is a period of 75th year, should be an occasion for introspection, and to bring those, the flavors, the flowers, their smell, and see them in the right context, not in the context of today, not in the context of dominance, because that would be colonialism again. I warn you, colonialism was nothing but dominance. Shorn of dominance is democracy. Science is democratic by definition. We should go by that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak Kumar. I mean, it was a very wonderful panel discussion, and as speakers were presenting very interesting, very engaging talk, we actually overshoot our time. We overshoot by quite a lot. So perhaps we may not be able to have a round of discussion. Perhaps we may have to wind up here. The four panelists gave, at last, Deepak Kumar pointed out the fragrance of how in the freedom movement, the science, technology, and the Indian scientists and technologists played an important role. Dr. M.D. Srinivas, you wanted to say something? Yeah, please.
Just a couple of comments, because maybe just two issues. One is the question of nationalism. Professor Deepak Kumar very rightly asked, is there an Indian term for this? Do our Shastras talk about this? So there is no nationalism. The nation state is a modern European concept. But we have the concept of Swarajya that goes back to the Vedas. And it was what was used by Shivaji Chhatrapati in Hindvi Swarajya in 17th century. And it was what was used by the great freedom fighters in 19th century. And it became mainstream with the Dadabhai Nauroji declaring in the 1906 Indian National Congress that Swarajya is Swaraj is what we want. There was a debate in 1928 when Jawaharlal Nehru got the Congress objectives changed in the Madras Congress. The Congress objectives were to attain Swaraj by peaceful means, by all peaceful means. Jawaharlal Nehru got it changed to attain independence. Then Mahatma Gandhi writes an editorial. There's a debate going on between Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi at that time, where Jawaharlal Nehru declares that Mahatma Gandhi, you don't understand that the Western civilization is going to triumph over all the rest of the world. Anyway, Gandhiji writes an editorial called Swaraj versus Independence. He says independence is a negative concept. It is Utshrinkalata. Swarajya is self-governance, self-rule, but self-control, and it's a philosophical Indian concept, and he has explained it in great detail in Swaraj. And another brief comment on there was a point that Indian sciences had the same epistemology as modern Western science. I think that's a very contestable point. I've done a lot of work on this. For instance, Indian mathematics has nothing of Euclid. It has proofs, but it doesn't have the philosophy of Euclid. And there is no search for absolute truth either in mathematics or in science. Scientific theories are transient and they have to enable us to live well in the world. They are not to understand the ultimate truths of God's creation. This is very explicit, and they are not to dominate over the rest of the world either, not to exploit. So these are major epistemological differences between modern Western science and the Indian scientific tradition. I mean, there are many contributions of Indian science which Greco-Western tradition adopted. There are many that we can adopt from. The whole of modern botany arises from what was written in Hortus Malabaricus. The Edava and the teachers gave such details of plants and their classification. So people can accept from different civilizational sort of frameworks, but they will re-adopt those discoveries to their own framework. And epistemologically, I don't think India has a Pratyaksha Pramana, which doesn't constitute an important part of most of mathematics or scientific theories in the West. In the level at which in India it is highlighted, that it overrides Anumana and Shabda. So there are many epistemological issues. It's a very brief time to go into that. I'm very glad that most panelists have brought out many fundamental issues, and I'm grateful that this discussion was organized. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. I think Dr. Professor Krishna also wanted to say something, so I'll ask him. Please carry on.
No, I just wanted to make a point that I said that the epistemological roots of modern science could be traced to the medieval and ancient periods. This is basically with reference to P.C. Ray's History of Hindu Chemistry, 2 volumes, you know. He, in response to Berthelot, who was one of the granddads in Europe, who asked whether there are any traditions of chemical sciences. So P.C. Ray goes on to translate Rasendra Chintramani and Rasa Prakasa Sudhakara, the 2 texts of the 12th and the 13th century text, to show that the roots of the modern science can be traced to our own traditions. I'm not using the term Western, I'm using the term modern science, because Western science is to be used in a very restrictive sense, which is to the geographical regions of the Western Europe and things like that. When I say modern science, the science belongs to everyone and to us also. And this is also a kind of a response to people like Basala, who created a whole a corpus of theses on history of science, on the colonial science, who basically talked about the non-science societies, you know, as far as the colonial countries are concerned. So what I was trying to use the epistemological roots of the modern science, that was a very, very important to show that this was not an empty space, you know. We had a tradition in mathematics, in astronomy, in chemical sciences, instruments, you know, the whole. So only in those particular thing I was trying to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. I suppose we can come to the last part of our program. And of course, there are a lot of issues that have emerged here, which we can discuss, which are very enlightening. But for want of time, we may have to wind up here. But as pointed out, a large number of interesting facets have come in this panel discussion, which would feed into this program, which is going to be a year and more long program. So this is not the first and last. We will also have another panel discussion on the same topic very soon. So we will also get another set of people. So many experts who have worked on this area, we would like to bring in and have a discussion. In today's discussion, there have been very interesting points which have been made, like Professor Sriram pointed out that there is a long tradition of science in India in its own way. And there was a huge colonial denial for opportunity. And it is against this denial that people have risen up. And it is not a colonial contribution, if one can say so. We should not look at it as a colonial contribution, but it's something that in struggle, in opposition to colonial system, that the Indian science and technology, whatever that emerged, has come in. And he has also pointed out how the spirit of Swarajya infused many of these founders. In his talk by Dr. M.D. Srinivas, he also pointed out the spirit of Swaraj in the founders, and also pointed out how the stalwarts like Srinivas Ramanujan or C.V. Raman emphasized on Indian journals, basically, essentially meaning that the foundation should be Indian. It's not just journal, one thing, but it's basically the foundation of Indian science should be laid on its ground. And V.V. Krishna, in his erudite talk, rejected the Basila's colonial science diffusionist notion, and also described the historical process of the emergence of scientific community up to 1930s, which laid the foundation for the post-republic science and technology institutions in India. And Deepak Kumar enlightened with his talk on taking up some keywords like colonialism, vernacular, native, freedom, and so on, and did by explicating its ontological meaning, brought in certain new dimension to this whole debate in this panel. Thank you to him for that. And then he has also showed that how the founders of modern science in India, modern scientific technological institution in India, like Ashutosh Mukherjee, twisted the system to the nation's benefit, diverged it from the colonial directions. This is also something that will take away from this discussion. There were many, many points which we have noted, and we will take it up. And I thank all the panelists for this wonderful time. And now I would request Professor Dr. Ruchir Gupta to present the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Director. It was such a nice discussion. In fact, this discussion we could not afford to have much time for discussion. There was a nice description and illustration by all the panelists. I wish if we could have some more time, the overall what the result of this discussion could have been much better. But as you said, this is not the last panel discussion. We'll be organizing more such panel discussions. So, I mean, I would like to sincerely pay my thanks to all the panelists, Professor Deepak Kumar, Professor V.V. Krishna, Professor M.D. Srinivas, and Professor M.S. Sriram for their very nice presentation and discussion. I'm also thankful to Vigyan Prasad for organizing this panel discussion and the technical team behind that who's actually running the show. People involved from Vigyan Vatu is also deserve a nice thank. And last but not least, the audience who made this program successful. I'm also thankful to them. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thanks to all the panelists and participants and people who are watching this program through Vigyan Prasad's social media streams, and also India Science Television. India Science Television is India's the first television channel, OTT-based television channel for science and technology. We would request all of you to please download the app and use it to reach and take messages related to science and technology and its development in India today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.